Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to study Job 25 and learn how to be a successful parent. The Bible tells us the intent of every man's heart is evil from his youth. However, the Bible describes Noah and Job as being blameless and upright. For us, this raises the question of how us parents take our children who are intent on evil and transform them into people who are blameless and upright. In this video, we're going to learn that discipline is the key to being successful parents and that fathers need to be proactive in this process. Now let's start with some geographical context. This is a map of the Middle East. It's about 3,000 miles from the left of this map to the right. It's also about 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles, so what you see here is about the size of the United States. The Old Testament took place in the east half of this map. The New Testament took place in the west half of this map. Now, as far as the book of Job, we're not given a lot of geographical information. Job 1:1 tells us there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. We don't know where Uz was, so that doesn't help us much. Job 1:3 tells us Job was the greatest of all the men of the east. Well, east was over here, and so that tells us Job would have lived over in this area somewhere, probably in or near modern-day Iran. Now, for most of the books of the Bible, the geographical context is important in order to understand the book. That is not true of the book of Job. There is very little geographical information in Job, and what we do know really doesn't add a whole lot to the story. So what this tells us is the story of Job is intended to stand all alone. Whereas most of the books of the Bible tell the story and the history of the nation of Israel and contribute something to that story, the book of Job does not do that. The book of Job stands alone. It's a story about Job, and it's intended to teach us about suffering and sin. And so we don't have to understand a whole lot about the geographical context in order to understand Job, and we don't need to connect Job to the other events of the Bible. However, we do have to interpret the ideas expressed in Job in light of the rest of the Bible. Now let's review the story of the book of Job. At the beginning of the story, Job was healthy and wealthy. For example, Job 1:1 tells us, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And then there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan, and Yahweh bragged about Job, about how Job was blameless, upright, and feared God. Satan said the only reason Job followed God was because Job was wealthy. Satan said if Job lost all his possessions, then he would curse God. So Yahweh gave Satan permission to test Job. So Satan went out and he destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Well, Job did not curse God. Job stayed loyal to God. At that point of the story, 3 men named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar came to visit Job. They were Job's friends, and they came to comfort and encourage Job. And then there was a dialogue between these 4 men. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, and that pattern kept repeating. The general gist of this dialogue was these 3 friends tried to convince Job he was suffering because he had sinned. Job kept insisting that he was innocent. Now, the passage we're going to look at today is Bildad's last speech, Job chapter 25. And before we look at that, we're going to look at a couple verses in Job 23. Because again, throughout this, Job had kept insisting that he was innocent. And we'll take a look at an example of that in Job 23, and then we'll see what Bildad had to say in response to that. So let's look at Job 23, verse 10. But God knows the way I take, and again, this is Job speaking. But God knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to God's path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. Now notice phrases like held fast. Job said, I have held fast to God's path. Notice kept his way. Job said, I have kept God's way. Notice not departed. Job said, I have not departed from God's commands. And so through this, Job was declaring that he was innocent, and Job was declaring that he was not suffering because he had sinned. And so Bildad's response then to this was what we find in Job 25. And let's start reading at verse 1. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, Dominion and all belong to him who establishes peace in his heights. Now, one of the keys to understanding the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, is understanding who the pronouns refer to. Sometimes that's easier said than done. In this case, we have the pronoun him. The pronoun him refers to the one who establishes peace in his heights. That's a poetical reference to God. So Bildad is referring to God here. Notice the word dominion. The word dominion is the idea of power and authority. It's also the idea of having a kingdom. And so basically here, Bildad said dominion, power, authority, and the kingdom belong to God, the one who establishes peace in his heights. Notice the word awe. The word awe is the idea of fear and dread. And so here Bildad said, awe, fear, and dread belong to God. In other words, humans should fear God. Now keep in mind, Bildad was not the author of Job. Bildad was not inspired when he said this. And so Bildad was not necessarily correct in what he said. The author of Job, the one who wrote this, is merely telling us what Bildad said. The author is not saying that he agreed with Bildad, nor is the author saying we should agree with Bildad. The author is merely telling us what Bildad said. Now, in this particular case, I agree with what Bildad said. But again, we should not use these verses to form our theology and our beliefs about God and come to the conclusion whether or not indeed dominion and all belong to God. I agree with it because I believe the rest of the Bible backs that up. Now let's go on to verse 3. Is there any number to God's troops? And upon whom does his light not rise? How then can a man be just with God? Or how can he be clean who is born of woman? Now again, we see the pronoun his. That's a reference back to the previous verse, and it refers to God. And there are 4 rhetorical questions here. The first one, is there any number to God's troops? The implied answer is no. Second question, upon whom does God's light not rise? Well, the implied answer is no one. In other words, God's light rises on everyone. Verse 4, how then can a man be just with God? The implied answer is a man cannot be just with God. Last question, how can he be clean who is born of woman? Another way of saying that is, how can one who is born of a woman be clean? Again, the implied answer is he can't. Now, keep in mind this is Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. Hebrew poetry is about repetition, addition, and contrast. In repetition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the same thing in a different way. In addition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then adds something to it. And in contrast, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the opposite. Verse 3 is an example of addition. First, Bildad made this statement. It was in the form of a question, but he said, there is no number to God's troops. And then he added to that the idea that God's light shines on everyone. Verse 4 is an example of repetition. First, Bildad said, a man cannot be just with God. Then Bildad said, a man born of woman cannot be clean. That's just 2 different ways of saying the same thing, basically saying no man is pure before God. Notice also the words, how then? In this case, those 2 words function the same as therefore. In other words, up here, Bildad said there's no limits to God's troops. God's light shines on everyone. Therefore, a man cannot be just before God. Now, as I said, so basically, again, Bildad is trying to make the case that no man is pure before God. As I said earlier, Bildad was not the author of Job. He was not inspired. But again, in this case, I agree with his conclusion. However, I don't agree with how he got there. I don't agree with his idea that somehow this proves this. All right, let's go on to verse 5. If even the moon has no brightness and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and the son of man, that worm. Now, these verses repeat the concept that Bildad expressed in verses 3 and 4. Basically, he was saying a man cannot be right before God. In verses 3 and 4, sorry, I went the wrong direction there. In verses 3 and 4, he said there's no number to God's troops, therefore man cannot be right before God. And as these verses, he's saying even the moon and stars are not perfect, therefore man cannot be perfect either. Now keep in mind, the reason Bildad was saying all this was that in previous chapters, Job had insisted he was innocent. And so here, Bildad's trying to make the point that no one is innocent. Well, if no one is innocent, then Job must have sinned at some point. And then Bildad's point was that Job was suffering because he had sinned. Now, there's a problem with Bildad's argument. Bildad's argument also meant that Bildad and his friends were not pure. However, Bildad and his friends were not suffering the way Job was. And so, if Bildad is correct about all this, how would the fact that all humans are sinners prove Job's suffering was caused by sin when other people who were also sinners were not suffering? And so while I think Bildad says some things here that are correct, ultimately I don't think that Bildad is proving his case. He is not proving that Job was suffering because he had sinned. Having said all that, Bildad does raise a very good question. It's basically this: are humans good or bad? Are humans inherently evil, or are humans inherently good? Well, let's take a look at Genesis 8:21 to start to answer that question. The Lord said to himself, "The intent of man's heart is evil from his youth." So notice the intent of man's heart is evil. And so Yahweh himself is saying the intent of man's heart is evil. Notice this phrase, from his youth. So from youth, from childhood, even from birth, the intent of a man's heart is evil. So basically, God is saying here that humans are inherently evil and bad. Next, we're going to look at quite a few verses from the book of Romans. And these verses are a collection of quotes from the Old Testament. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin, as it is written, "There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Now, all these quotes are basically saying there's not a single human who is good. And so that tells us Bildad was correct, that this idea that no human is good. However, having said that, how do we account for the following verses? This is Genesis 6:9. "These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God." Notice the words righteous and blameless are used to describe Noah. Let's look also at Job 1:1. "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil." Again, notice the words blameless and upright are used to describe Job. So if all humans are bad, then how did Noah and Job earn this praise? How did Noah and Job become blameless and upright? More importantly, what does that mean for us? If our children are inherently evil, and we saw that they are, what do we as parents do? How do we raise our children so that they could hopefully be described as being blameless and upright? Let's take a look at a few verses that answer that question for us. Let's start in Proverbs 22, verse 6. "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Notice the word train. Parents need to train their children how to behave. Notice the second line. There's this idea, there's this hope of success. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So there's some hope there that if you train your child, there will be some success. Proverbs 22, verse 15. "Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him." Notice the word foolishness. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Children are inherently foolish. Notice the word discipline. Children need to be disciplined in order to remove the foolishness. The rod of discipline will remove it. It refers back to foolishness. So discipline will remove the foolishness. Again, notice in the second line there's this hope of success. The rod of discipline will remove foolishness far from him. Proverbs 23 verse 13. Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. Again, notice the word discipline. Notice this is a command. Do not hold back discipline. And notice also the second line, there's this idea that there's some harshness may be required to raise children. Obviously, in our society, that's very politically incorrect. But the Bible says what it says. And the Bible is clear that sometimes in raising children, as parents, you're going to have to be a little bit harsh with your children in order to properly discipline them and train them. Proverbs 29 verse 15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. Notice the word shame. If children are not properly trained and disciplined, then there's going to be shame, particularly on the part of the mother. And this is Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Notice the word fathers. Paul here singles out fathers and makes a very clear command to them that they have to be involved in the discipline and instruction of their children. And notice that the command includes both discipline and instruction. And then Hebrews 12, verse 11. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by discipline, afterwards discipline yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Again, notice the word discipline. Notice also the pronouns it. Both times it refers to discipline. And notice again, there's this hope of success. Afterwards, or after the discipline yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So there's that hope of success if discipline is properly used and employed. So what do we learn from all this? Humans are inherently evil. In order for our children to become blameless and upright, we parents need to train, discipline, reprove, and instruct our children. As we do this, we need to remember that discipline is a vital part of parenting, and fathers especially need to proactively discipline and instruct their children. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.